Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the member model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $70, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $140 a year, you get all of that, plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast featuring Kate Riga. We are in the thick of it now. I think yesterday was 3 weeks until election day. So, it's in any election, I remember when it was okay, we're at the 1 year point, 6 months, 3 months, a week ago. Now we're within a month. We are right there. We're right coming into the final lap of the campaign, and the tension is upon everyone. There was that at the Democratic convention. There was that moment when Michelle Obama said, there's going to come a time when there's a bad poll, and you're going to have to decide for yourself: are you gonna, crumble, or are you gonna say, like, okay, that's what is, not to I can't remember if it's is it The Godfather. That's the life we've chosen, right? You get bad polls. This is a high stakes game we play in, and of course it's not a game. The consequences are immense. It's stressful, and everybody is stressed. And I did a post, I think it was yesterday, maybe the day before yesterday, I lose track, basically on the mass psychology of the Democratic faction in American politics. And I think we all know that it's a cliche, right? That the going gets a little tough, and Democrats tend to freak out. They think they're losing. Not only do they think they're losing, they're thinking about who messed up. You don't win every election, right? You don't win every election. But who messed up? It's not just if we're already kind of fast forwarding and saying it's not just that Kamala lost the election. She did it. She messed up. We picked the wrong horse. All of these kind of misgivings and awfulizing and so forth. And I do think this is built into the psychology of Democrats as they exist in the early 21st century. And that sounds very kind of negative and everything, and it is in a way. It does suck because Republicans do not think this way. I have been watching national campaigns very closely on a professional basis for a quarter century. And I can tell you, Republicans basically always think they're winning, even when the evidence is they're not winning, right? They think they're winning. And Democrats, unless the available evidence basically shows it is literally impossible to lose, they think they're losing. And what I argued in this post is that sort of wobbliness, I think, is the flip side of the things that most of us like about the sort of the political faction that most of us listening to this podcast are part of, the sort of the broad Democratic center-left political faction in the United States. And that is a belief in civic democracy, a belief in empiricism, a belief in the rule of law. These are all ways of approaching the world, of litigating conflicts in society that at their root are based on doubt. What civic democracy is about is that you don't always know who's right, right? You're not certain you're right. The other people might be right. You also don't. You also know that you will not always be in charge. So you want a system that keeps things okay for the people who are not in charge, right? The uncertainty is at the center of that. Empiricism, science, all the good things we care about. These are fundamentally uh, uh, ways of approaching the world based on doubt. Empiricism means fundamentally that all of our knowledge is contingent. It's subject to more information coming in. In any case, the things we like about the democratic worldview, for lack of a better word, has this tendency towards uncertainty and self-doubt inherent in it. That doesn't mean that you have to like fall apart at the first signs of difficulty, the way that many Democrats do. And I think that um, it's really incumbent on Democrats to sort of strengthen those counter muscles. My point is only that it is not an accident that it's this way. There are certain inherent factors that make it this way, in the same way that the authoritarian tendency means that the only way that you can really think of existing in society is to dominate. There's the dominating and there's the dominated, and that's how it works. And you have certainty. I'm right. I'm in charge. That whole kind of thing. Again, these ways, these basic mindsets are kind of built into the different factions, and that has become even more exaggerated in the Trump era. Enough for Josh's amateur sociology here. Uh, we're in the thick of it now. In the last couple weeks, there's been this like huge Democratic freakout, right, about Harris's chances of winning. And look, we don't know what is going to happen in this election. It's there's high uncertainty. It looks like it's probably close. High uncertainty and close are not the same thing. We're going to talk about that in this episode. But that lurch to freak out is not really based on much actual evidence at all. If you're freaked out now, you should have been freaked out 2 and 3 weeks ago. And the stakes are high, so there's a lot to be worried about. But broadly speaking, if you were kind of feeling like, hey, we're doing this, 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, and now you're utterly freaked out, you're reacting to things that are not like hard objective information. You're caught in the sort of the eddies and changes of vibes and stuff like that. So we're gonna move past the meta in our discussion today, but also get into all this kind of campaign psychology and so forth. So, Kate, where are we? What's going on? What do you make of the situation?
Yeah, I also want to add that I think you're totally right that the kind of psychological disposition of each party is really coming into play here. But also, we have to remember likely a lot of our listeners are still kind of swimming around the dregs of Twitter, and for good reason, right? There hasn't been another site that has been able to kind of replicate what was good about Twitter, or maybe what remains good. And you have to remember that the guy who owns Twitter is actively campaigning for Trump, right? I mean, that's not an exaggeration. He is
It's
on the
pretty crazy.
campaign
It's pretty
trail.
crazy. Yep, yep, yep.
He is boosting right-wing content, or those right-wing creators are paying to be boosted. Whoever is kind of the acting upon it, that's what's happening. So I think it's really noticeable because we're professionals in the political world, and part of our job kind of is predicated on not falling prey to the vibes and the narratives if they're baseless. But every time I've been on Twitter in the last kind of week or two, I mean, it's taken a toll on me. Like, I have felt myself being kind of dragged right down into despair about everything. So you also, I think it's good to keep in mind that we're not playing on kind of a neutral, unbiased playing board right now, and that is probably, if you are on Twitter, that's got to be some of the kind of artificial doldrums that are being injected into the Democratic side of the debate right now.
hmm and in addition to that, even let's assume what is not the case, which is that you had a non-interfering Elon Musk running the platform. That there's something just natural in the fact that, like, Trump supporters, they're doing it. Trump's got this. It's happening. Trump's winning. He's gonna. It's all going great. You see that, you can know that is partly a bluff, partly their psychology, but you see all these Democrats like, oh no, did you see the latest?
Mhm.
That's why, in this post that I did, I it's not so much how Democrats act individually, although it's that too. It's how they act collectively, because you can't not you can't not hear what everybody is saying, right? And that's why it's so key to, pilots have this thing, instrument only flight. When you're in a storm, you do not look outside. You do not pay attention to your bodily sensations about what's up, what's down, what direction you're moving in. You look at your instruments, because you're going to be fooled by all that stuff. And we have to take that analogy to navigate the final stages of a campaign, especially one that really is very close and could go either way. You have to just look at, the closest we have to objective metrics, because you're hearing all those things and they're going to affect your sense of what's up and what's down.
And I think part of this too is in terms of what, kind of quote unquote metrics we have, it's polling, right? And forecasting based on polling. And I read a lot about recent polls, to get ready for this episode. And it's so funny. It doesn't matter who's writing it, the pattern persists across all the analysis of these polls, which are Trump stuff is kind of delivered to you, Trump positive polling as is, and then Harris positive polling to a person has a caveat
It's
section, which
amazing. It's amazing.
is,
It is
you
amazing.
know, which in some ways, they're trying to not look stupid after the last two presidential cycles had misses in Democrats' direction. So the graph is always, call a response bias, or we missed Trump voters here last time, so be aware. But it does leave you with the impression there cannot be any good news for Kamala Harris, because every time she gets something, say we get a +4 Harris poll out of Pennsylvania from that Siena poll, then it's has an addendum of like, and we're not sure about this, and you should be really suspicious of this. And then when it's a good Trump poll, you're like, well, that makes sense, that he's doing so much better in the Sun Belt than prior. So I think that's in the mix as well. And you kind of you alluded to this in the intro, Josh, but it's been a stable race in terms of the averages, right? You can look at the line, from 538, and it's moved hardly at all, right? She's been up nationally kind of 2 to 3 points ever since the initial ascension bump that kind of locked her into where she is
Yep.
took place. And then on the state level, the averages there too have been quite stable. And there you see a little bit more swings on the individual poll basis, but not a ton, right? I mean, we're still talking about what seems to be a psychologically massive different result of, say, a Harris +2 to a Trump +1, but that's a very small range, right? And it's kind of you got at this point that a close election and an uncertain election are not exactly the same thing, which is why I think everyone feels like they're losing their minds because you look at this, the 538 forecast and maybe it's kind of he's giving a small edge to Harris, right? And then the second most likely option is either Harris or Trump accumulating more than 300 electoral votes, which, by the standards of today is like a
It's like a
landslide,
landslide. Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, I was talking to someone about this the other day. You look at 2020 and at the time, our reaction was like, "Damn, that is closer than we thought," right? Because the polling miss was fairly large that year, and we were going in with polls that showed Biden up like 8 points. But now, if a divine being kind of came down and was like, "Would you accept Harris winning by 2020 margins?" You'd be like, "Oh my god, what a comfy margin," right? You get the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, like, "Yes, please, my cup runneth over."
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally. That point we talked about, it's probably worth explicating a bit. Everybody is saying closest election ever, blah 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 blah. Not necessarily. What you do have is high uncertainty. And it's worth, when you see those forecasts that say, Harris 55% probability that she wins, and if you're sort of not versed in these numbers, you could say 55-45. I'm feeling that, right? But if it's more like if you said, uh, if your net worth were on the line and you could roll a dice, 55% probability. Well, in those terms, that might as well be 50-50. It's, in turn in uh in those terms. In any case, the point is, it if you look for the last few weeks, if you look at these averages, they do often it is the case that basically all the swing states, or almost all the swing states, are under 1 point difference, all of them in the averages. And so that shows you that could just one side have a little extra advantage and Trump or Harris win all the swing states. And then it's not close at all in the electoral college. In any case, I just making the point that close and uncertain are not the same thing.
So let's look at what the campaigns are actually doing in these last few weeks. The Harris campaign, I think, really smartly has seemed to internalize the lesson that when she is not actively making news, she is bounced out of it and it kind of becomes the Trump show again. And of course, now that's not an unalloyed plus for him because he is so rake steppy that, it's often a negative headline. But a big lesson it seems that the Harris campaign has tried to take from 2016 and 2020 is that fighting on Trump's grounds, where it's all about Trump and he's the main character, has not worked as well for Democrats as maybe prior, valid seeming theories would seem to suggest. And she has run a campaign that is very much, here's who I am, right? I'm not going to respond to all his baits. I'm not going to play on the playing field he wants to play on. I'm going to do my own thing. And that has really been reflected in a series of, I think you could even call them high risk interviews, or at least very challenging interviews, in contra what the mainstream media seems to think about them. But that includes, a rigorous 60 minutes doing, town halls with live voter questions. That this week that meant going on with Charlemagne the God, who's kind of become a must stop campaign stop for Democrats, but who is known for doing rigorous, hardball interviews. And this is kind of capped off with the fact that she's going to talk to Brett Baer on Fox News. And I think all of these events, this is the same bucket of kind of doing Howard Stern and doing Colbert. It's like these are newsy events. These conversations are going to get more coverage than a run of the mill interview because they're unusual, right? Or they're with a a tough question asker. News is going to be made out of it, right? Or it's a platform that a candidate would never usually kind of spend her ultra valuable time on in the last few weeks. So I think it's really smart because it's not just the interview, it's not just the clips you get from the interview, it's the news event of the interview, right? And that keeps, really smartly, I think, sticking her right back into the headlines. And then in a kind of advantageous development for her, that her these kind of high profile interviews that she keeps kind of doing very ably and getting some good moments out of them is juxtaposed with Trump either running away from interviews, right? Like refusing to do the 60 minutes, abruptly canceling a CNBC interview with one of the kind of friendliest quote unquote mainstream reporters out there. And then, we'll get into this later, but just losing his mind on stages and rallies.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing because, a lot of people, a lot of Democrats, worried Democrats, were saying over the last week, Trump's doing 10 events a day and Kamala's got a light schedule, she's coasting, all this kind of stuff. What is always very important for us to remember is that campaign's not about us. And the campaign is probably, I mean, we know the campaign is looking at disaffected voters, occasional voters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have probably identified a few small chunks of the electorate that they think are what it's going to come down to. And we as observers are not really going to see what the campaign is doing for those people. Now, that doesn't mean that like they're geniuses and they've got it all worked out and they're doing exactly everything right. But what it does mean is that what they are doing, whether it is a flawed or a very, bang on strategy, is just mostly out of our view. And that's tough for observers who feel rightly like we have a lot on the line, right? The real action is not in our view. Totally agree on you're I feel like we are at least finally past, when you doing a bit, when are you sitting down again with another Lester Holt or Dana Bash or whatever, that whole thing. She's doing lots of interviews now. And, you mentioned I guess a Joe Rogan interview may happen. They're kind of putting out that it's being discussed. I don't think it's been finalized yet. The Fox thing has been finalized. I think you were alluding to this a moment ago. One of the big things about the Fox thing isn't so much what comes out of that interview, is they want people to see like Kamala. She's not afraid to go on Fox. She's going to go, she's going to go, get into it with Brett Baer. That sends a signal, you know, not afraid, willing to do all these kind of interviews. And you mentioned sometimes you have interviews that are, generally friendly, celebrities, influencers, whatever, but they're also weird. And here, not weird in the JD sense, weird in the good sense. They're just kind of, they're not straight-laced people. So you go on an interview with them, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Even if they're, even if they're being friendly, it's just, you go on with a rapper, you go on with a kind of an influencer, who knows what's going to happen, and that's unpredictable. And so there's so many different things happening here, and clearly one of the big things they are trying to do, the Harris campaign is trying to do, is say we're not afraid of that. Yeah, it's going to be unpredictable, but Kamala is on top of things, and she can roll with the punches, and she's not afraid of that.
So I think you're totally right about the Fox News going on is almost as big a deal as what comes out of it because, for two reasons. One is which the metric of strong leader has always been really important in kind of presidential polling and attitudes towards presidential candidates, right? There's the famous Bill Clinton quote about better to be strong and wrong than weak and right.
Yep.
And Harris, as a female candidate, obviously, who for years, had female candidates have been dogged by the misogynistic assumption that they're less strong than men, has to be aggressive, come out swinging to take that mantle from Trump, because it's really important. Like, strong leader is also related to kind of who you trust on the economy, which is another huge metric, and who you trust on the world stage. And so there's that piece twinned with the fact that she is so much younger than Trump. And even aside from just the statistical ages, she appears much more younger and much more vital and much more energetic than Trump. And
And then her age, in fairness. I mean,
yeah,
Kamala Harris
totally.
is I think 59. She's almost 60 years old. 60 isn't what it used to be, but she presents young.
Yeah, exactly. And so doing these kind of potentially combative high risk interviews, I think also shores up that impression that she is, she's like the spry spring chicken who is not going to say no to stuff, who's going to do all these big events, who's not afraid, who's not kind of, saying no to debates and making up excuses and pulling out of things. And yeah, she'll go on unfriendly terrain. She is tough enough to withstand that. And I think that is huge in terms of, just kind of impressionistic atmosphere.
Yeah, it's you said that toughness is often the proxy or the actual thing for, like, good on the economy. I would even go further. It almost is the entire thing. Because, like, who has any idea good on the economy? What is that even? What are you basing that on, right? This is it is a lot of these things are, because you saw those when Trump was doing much better than Biden 6 months ago. You would see these polls that look crazy that said, like, on the economy, well, Trump is 20 points ahead of Biden on the economy. And then they would have on protecting democracy, Trump's 10 points ahead. You're like, dude, what? Like, even like he's saying he's against democracy. How can he be good? But it's an example of strong, tough. Okay, anything. He's good on abortion, right? You go good on
Yeah, right.
good on whatever. And so, in despite what the Trump people might say, the president is not going to get into a fist fight with Vladimir Putin, right? The president is not going to need to, uh, you know, run a mile and a half really fast to deal with the situation in Ukraine. So what it really does come down to, I mean, in a way, it's not it's not symbolic to talk about going on this interview, going on that interview. It's saying, like, I don't get I'm unflappable. I'm going to go on Fox. Maybe they're going to pull some bullshit, but I'm going to be fine cuz I'm on top of this, and I don't go wobbly. Democrats are sort of the wobbly party, but they need a leader who's not going to go wobbly, not going to go wobbly. I'm not scared. I'm quick on my feet, and if you think about it, those, to the extent that all of this meta stuff about dominance and strength and everything is real, those are actually uh, those are the qualities that kind of do matter, to the extent they do at all. That kind of, like, you know, I'm going to go and I'm going to go into it, and whatever happens, I'm going to be fine. That is the strength we're talking about. And I will say that what we have seen over the last 2.5 months or so is that, whether it's the debate or the convention or the different interviews and so on and so forth, it was weird that Republicans and a lot of the mainstream press were able to kind of float this idea of fragility, because really, in every high stakes moment, she's pulled it off. She hasn't really had any wobbly moments, and that says something. And so now, in the final weeks, they're trying to lean into that, and that is smart. Not only because she will do well, I think, but to the point you were making before, we need her to be the story.
Right. And I think it really is a recognition, the first time I've seen a recognition like this from the Democratic Party, that the media ecosystem is so hardwired for Republicans, right? And this is a really kind of creative way to wrest back control, which is to some degree comforting in these final weeks because I think a lot of us are most worried about some kind of October surprise, right? Whether that be engineered by foreign Trump supporting influence, Trump's campaign himself, the credulous mainstream media, some permutation of all of those things. And that kind of risk is much higher when you are completely unable to retain control of any kind of the news cycle. And they are doing this creative campaign that is predicated on wresting back control, even when it's kind of the odds are slanted against them doing so. So yeah, I think it's smart in every way, and I like the idea. We'll move on to Trump too, but I love the idea that what's the biggest lesson people took out of 2016, right? It was complacency. Now, I think that is not the whole story. I think in some ways Hillary Clinton was so saddled with decades of unfair baggage that there's no candidate alive kind of talented enough to shed it. But you can say a lot about this cycle. You can say that Democrats are bedwetters and anxious and love Monday morning quarterbacking, and all that's true. But this is not a complacent campaign, and it never has been. And will it be enough? Who knows in this calcified country? But she's being aggressive. She's doing things that are high risk, high reward. And that is just a different model than the last two presidential cycles we've seen.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but to an extent with this like, kind of leaning heavily into interviews mode that they're in right now, some of it seems to me to be a recognition, maybe even a public recognition. Yeah, the mainstream press is against us. I don't mean that in the sense of like they want Trump to win, but the sense in which we've discussed before that the national political news ecosystem is really hardwired for Republicans. And we are going to say it is hardwired, but we've got a good candidate and we're going to lean into fighting it. And it's again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that it has that feel to me.
No, I mean, I think that's been clear in the behavior too. Like during the many bouts of why aren't you talking to me or my friends in the news business? I mean, they've ignored it, right? They've been like, no, we're doing a bunch of interviews. We're just not doing the kind you like, right? They haven't kind of bowed to that pressure, which an older version of a Democratic candidate probably would have. So, I mean, I do think it's a recognition of those conditions. Now, meanwhile, the Trump campaign has seemed to lean into the we can't let this guy be in public any more than we have to because it's been disastrous. I mean, that's reflected most clearly in these situations where he would have to answer real questions, right? 60 minutes, a debate, CNBC to some degree, and the events that he still has done, which include a truly a sight to see rally turned him playing his Spotify playlist with this kind of Bloomberg economic event that was just a cataclysmic is revealing why they're trying to put their guy on kind of a tighter leash than before and just letting him play around in Madison Square Garden in front of a rally crowd.
Yeah, I've had just in the last I've had a couple things in the last 2 or 3 days that have occupied my attention that have kind of pulled me out of Twitter and the sort of the feed, for lack of a better word, kind of everything that is happening and what the vibes are and so on and so forth. And so I've been trying to get a read on, is something new breaking through now about Trump's mental state? Obviously, Democrats are always saying that, and I mean, look, he's a freak. He's they're right to say that, but that doesn't mean that it is breaking through beyond Democrats. There was this case where he just ditched the town hall and went with a mixtape basically, and that is being presented by a lot of Democrats as he has lost it at a different level that we than we usually mean Trump losing it. And it's funny because as best I understand this, what happens is they're having a town hall in rapid succession. There are a couple people have like medical events in the crowd. They need to bring in a doctor or whatever. Okay, so they're dealt with. That's done. And he says, let's not do any more questions. Let's listen to some songs. And then everybody listens to Trump's mixtape for about a half hour. And you've got some, you got the governor of North Dakota up there, I think, some other Republican people, and they're kind of they're all looking at each other like, what's going on here, dancing and stuff. and just as we know, Trump gets a lot of leeway from the powers that be for being weird. And what I was struck by is I've seen a number of Republicans either speak to this or do tweets and say, he just decided that we should listen to music, and people who weren't there are making it like it was weird, but it wasn't weird. It actually made sense, and we had a good time. And you hear that, and you're like, oh, okay. I mean, you're saying it wasn't weird, but it sounds weird. It sounds pretty weird, I guess there's this thing where they just kind of, last minute ditched the CNBC interview, which happened I think happened right after the Bloomberg interview. And just to give if you didn't see these clips from the Bloomberg interview, we know that Trump speaks in word salad and stuff like that. There was one of the questions, I think it's this guy Micklethwaite, who I think is basically the editor in chief of all Bloomberg, very, very high level Bloomberg, or something, one of the brass, been with Bloomberg forever, I think. In any case, he's interviewing Trump. One of his questions is, do you think Google should be broken up? And Trump says, well, in Virginia, you've got absentee ballots and they're doing funny stuff with the ballots and stuff. And the guy's like, dude, I asked you about Google. So there seems to be some critical so again, this isn't a word salad. It's like, dude, are you actually listening to anything I'm saying, kind of thing. So I get the sense that some Democratic campaigns and Democrats are kind of putting their ears to the ground and thinking like, is this real now? Is this part of the closing message, that Trump is really losing it in a way that is beyond losing? Because I do think we've seen for 9 years, but we've seen in this campaign, Trump could say, listen, I'm going to get all the illegals, douse them with gasoline and light them on fire. And that's what we're going to do. And people would say like, oh man, he's out of control, but it wouldn't matter. But if people think that he's losing it, he's actually mentally losing it, I do think that is politically damaging for him right now. What do you make of it, Kate? Is this just us Democrats kind of getting ourselves wound up, or is this real?
I think it goes beyond Democrats, partially because one of the early indicators is you're starting to see it get covered in the mainstream media. And not to say like, oh, Trump supporters are reading the New York Times' take on this, but it is a sign that it has bled from this is what we expect and what is baked in about Trump to this is something new and something a bit stranger than we've seen before. And I mean, the Trump bizarro rally thing, I saw some attempts to sane wash it, like some outlet called it an impromptu concert or something, which just does not convey the fact that on the teleprompter it said, please answer 2 more questions before the music. And then the music that he's playing is like the Ave Maria 7 times and then the YMCA, and he's just kind of standing there doing his swaying and bobbing, and everyone else on stage is like, what the fuck is going on? And then in the, as you said, the Bloomberg thing, he had the Google moment. And then another big one was he just started musing right there on stage, like, oh, I didn't know if I should do this interview or not. Like, he clearly like having buyer's remorse in the middle of a complete inability to even process the questions that he's being asked. And so I know that are in an era of like hashtag nothing matters, right? Trump's been insane for forever. You try to transcribe one of his speeches, and that's all the evidence you need to know that his brain is like working at on a weird level. But I just agree with you that it's getting worse. Like at that rally, he almost if you didn't know better, you would think he was high. Like it was so outside the realm of kind of normal social behavior. And I think it matters in this case because of what we talked about before, like the vitality gap, the age gap, the enthusiasm gap between him and Harris, I think makes him more vulnerable to he's really old and he's losing it in a way that he hasn't been before because he's covered by his like big insane energy, right? Which is he's still off, but he's energetically off, right?
Yeah,
And that was
yeah,
way
yeah,
better than Biden being kind of well-meaning but so physically fragile
yeah.
seeming. And any move of Trump's towards that fragility I think is bad for him because so much of his appeal is predicated on the strength thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, you hit that key point that like whatever you can say about Trump, whatever you can say about the word salad, you cannot deny that man, every time you look, he's off doing some rally or something and he's doing, and all this kind of stuff. And he the guy has a lot of energy, right? This is a low bar for like whether you should be president, but he does. And that has clearly made him immune. And he also has a lot of anger. Now, when you actually study mental decline, anger is often where people go as they are deteriorating in a cognitive way. But his anger reads as focus, right? He's hardcore. He's all in, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I can't get past the way that the defenses of the concert, for lack of a better word, were kind of just basically like the attacks, where they're like he just decided we were gonna kind of jam out and listen to songs, and if you were there, you would realize it worked. And you hear that and you're sort of like, that's kind of like it's a little Jim Jones, right? you know if you were there at the compound, you would have felt the energy and you knew it was the right thing to do, and you're like, okay, dude, I'm glad to hear it. I mean, you can't even think about, like, if Biden would do this, they would literally say, what is it, kind of like where you call an ambulance and you need someone taken for an evaluation or something like that. And if it were Harris, they would probably be saying, did she do shrooms before that? Because he had a shroomy kind of vibe to him, that kind of just, where it's not dancing, it's like swaying, and swaying ain't dancing.
Dissociatively, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to say because as we know, Trump is not judged by the same standards that everybody else is. But let's come back to the fact that we are, um, the vague plus side to where we are in this campaign is, as we've said many times before, we're down to maybe 4% of the electorate that just doesn't care about politics, doesn't pay attention to politics. So like in these last couple weeks, maybe the only time they're actually dialing in, and in their head, to the extent that they actually haven't made a decision here, which is insane, but let's bracket that off. Um, you're kind of thinking like Trump, yeah, he's rude and he's weird, but he's kind of a tough guy, busting heads and stuff. And if you see that he's kind of like off in la la land, you're kind of like, okay, maybe he's not up to it again. And again, it's sort of in our universe, and I think that this is where many Democrats were. It's sort of like, has Biden lost a step? Well, man, he can lose fucking 30 steps. I'm not going to go with Trump because Trump's insane, right? But if you don't care about politics, if you don't pay attention to politics, who's just mentally equipped to show up for work each morning is can be a pretty decisive thing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And it's the split screen. The split screen is the only thing that gives me any kind of indication that this might stick. That and the fact that even though we had some sane washing of this quote unquote concert, there have been a crop of pieces that have appeared in kind of mainstream outlets. And I know some of the cable shows kind of had a field day with this weird rally. And again, not saying that I think that will reach or convert MAGA voters, but it shows that it is, to at least a small degree, altering the news environment in a way that Trump's clear kind of mental issues up till this point have just gone unremarked upon and baked into the environment. And that stuff, even if, undecided voters or whatever aren't like reading these things, if there's one thing we know from the Biden, campaign at the beginning of this cycle, those impressions do trickle down even to people who aren't reading the news. And that's how you had everyone to a person saying, Biden's got one foot in the grave. He's basically dead. I mean, those narratives are not just formed from clips of Biden. They are formed from how those clips are being processed and repackaged and reported on. So to the extent that this is starting to happen now too, to the extent that this is a story in the last few weeks, I mean, there's no way to spin that helps Trump, right? Like, Trump is depending upon the fact that he can cover up how old he is, and any cracks in that veneer are obviously bad for him.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's no question. And it's also, I mean, it's I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I think as we saw with Biden, once you get to the point of feats of strength, like show us you are really sharp and on top of it and can process information quickly and in an organized way, at that point you're done, right?
Right.
And in some ways even more than clearly Biden could not couldn't do that. um and Trump, just the way his cognition has always worked. He's never had a kind of an organized thought process. Let's not forget that presidential cognition discourse started with Donald Trump, because he
Right.
clearly was not all there during his first term. And that's why we got into like cognitive tests and what is it, man, car, woman, whatever those things were. The other thing, and this is why I get concerned sometimes during these Democratic freakouts, because from one vantage point, okay, fine, everybody freaks out. Who cares? They're not going to stop voting the way they're going to vote. But it's not quite that simple. People get demoralized and people get pumped, and you want your people to be pumped in the final couple weeks, because you want them to show up. Some people just get a little demoralized. You need them canvassing and doing all that kind of stuff. You need them being pumped around their friends and on social media. So even layers of demoralization and non-demoralization, those things can have an effect. So I don't, again, I don't know. I'm still trying to get my head around whether something has happened in the last few days where this is becoming a thing. I guess we'll see in the over the next couple weeks.
Right. So I wanted to end our episode with some countervailing forces to the doomerism, e.g., points that the two of us are bullish about, or, kind of reasons to have hope, considering that all we have right now is a huge amount of uncertainty. And for me, I think it's that so many of the environmental factors right now favor Trump, right? I mean, we're seeing that. That's why he's kind of a stronger candidate now than he was in 2020. And that's because people are gloomy about the economy, right? People really don't like Biden, the current Democratic institution. Trump gets to run as somewhat of an outsider again, right? Was an outfit that fit him a lot more easily than when he was trying to run as an incumbent. And despite all of that, Harris probably has the very small edge right now, is the small favorite. And I think that is kind of a testament to a campaign well run. I think it's a testament to the weaknesses of Trump's candidacy, even in an environment that has been, heinous for incumbents like across many countries, right? And for me, the one data point that gives me kind of the most hope is the fact that Harris is slightly in favorable territory, like a point or so favorable. Trump is down 10 points in terms of favorability. And in these last few weeks, this election is going to be decided by late breaking, undecided voters who paid hardly any attention and barely know what they're talking about. But if you're one of those people who knows very little and has to pick at the last minute, are you going to pick the person that you probably don't like or the person that you do? I do think that is a good weapon in her arsenal. I think it is all to her own credit and to the campaign that she's run, which has been relentlessly about defining herself positively and not leaving a vacuum for Trump to fill. So, in terms of the data that we have, that's something that I think should make Democrats feel a little bit more bullish than the current kind of atmosphere of doom.
Yeah, the points you made are some of the ones that I would have made. I agree with those. I do think there is this general point you mentioned earlier in the episode where when Harris is up by 1 point, well, that's just margin of error. That's a toss up. That's statistically insignificant. When Trump is up by 1, well, he's winning. This is done. Right. There is this. Now we know that with national popular vote, right, she needs to probably be some uncertainty about this, probably needs to be at least 2 points ahead. But even with all that adjustment, what I said is still true. Some of that is bias. Some of that is just the recollection of what happened in 2016 and 2020. I think at some level is a lot of people's sense of how is she not blowing this out of blowing the doors off these things? Why is it so close? But you come back to, I think she's ahead. Now, polls never end up exactly where the final average was. So that does not mean she's going to win or is guaranteed she's going to win. But I think it is an important just reality setting that all things being equal, she looks in a little better shape than he does. The other thing I come back to is, and this has been a kind of a defining thing for me through this whole cycle. Everybody is worried that he is going to outperform the polls again. I am worried about that. But pollsters made all sorts of changes after the 2020 election to make absolutely sure they weren't caught off guard again. I think it is at least as likely that they slightly overshot that correction than it is the case that with all those changes, they're still going to end up missing. I think the most likely thing is just they got it right. Right? They made adjustments and whatever, and now they have it right. But again, don't rule out the possibility that the changes they have made, which are things like, and we can get into this in a future episode, voter recall, where they balance by who'd you vote for last time and kind of stuff. That is an example of something where all through the history of polling, you weren't supposed to do that because it gives an advantage to the party that lost the last election, i.e. Trump. So there's all these things they did. Again, there are real reasons to think they might be underestimating Harris. Not saying count on that, but that is a real possibility. I think there are a lot of signs of greater enthusiasm for the Democrats. Um, do these things do these things guarantee anything? Of course not. But they do at least line up with how Democrats were underestimated a bit in 2022. And again, to the extent that the sort of the pro Trump argument is that he's got this strength among low propensity voters, right? Now, there's another name for low propensity voters. It's people who don't vote. Now, you got a high turnout election, maybe they will vote, and maybe they're going to put him over the edge and he wins, and that's our next 40 years. But that's kind of, there's a bit of looking for an inside straight there, right? So again, I think there are reasons to go into that night a little less than 3 weeks from now. Not that you know the outcome, not that anything's guaranteed, but not feeling necessarily like the kind of the tide is going against you. Feel like the tide's looking okay, and would hope for the best.
Yeah, I was going to mention the low propensity thing as well, which we've discussed on other episodes, particularly Trump's kind of bid for the young bro vote, which has always had the really obvious downside that they don't vote very often, and he's put no effort whatsoever into expanding the base into, you know, what we might call the Nikki Haley vote, or the kind of older school Republican vote, who are people who are definitely going to show up and who would be in policy alignment with Trump on almost everything,
Yeah.
but his disregard for democracy and the Constitution are so concerning to them that they, you know, made the effort of going out in these primaries and lodging a protest vote for a candidate who wasn't in the race anymore. And Harris has been doing everything to try to win those very high propensity voters over to her side. So you've got a better ground game, you know, just a better theory of the case, working, you know, for her as well. And we're in a situation where it's only because of kind of built-in structural impediments that this is even that we're even talking about this, right? Like, if we lived in a country actually governed by the popular vote,
A full democracy. Yeah.
guess who wouldn't be nervous right now?
Yeah.
Everyone listening to this pod.
There is no one who thinks he is going to win the popular vote. Now, obviously, as we know, that doesn't matter, but it's worth having in the back of your mind that it's only an issue in that sense. And I want to just briefly add to what you said about those Haley voters. At a certain level, they're Republicans. Most of them are probably going to go back and vote for Trump. But it does go back into this high propensity and low propensity. It's hard to get people to vote in general. This is a fraction of the Republican electorate that was willing to go out to vote for someone who mathematically could not win. And the only sort of logic of doing it was kind of mix of on principle. And so people like Kate and I would point it out that, they're voting for Nikki Haley. That's a triple bank shot, right? If you're talking about like playing pool or something, right? It's a very ornate kind of reason to turn out to vote. Those people turn out to vote. And, as you said, with kind of like, bros, this is like, I don't want to get into the gender wars here, but I think we all know that young women are a little more together than young men. They brush their teeth, right? They make appointments to see the doctor, right? Young men are not great. And I say that as a former young man and father of two future young men. They're not great. And if you're relying on them to kind of like, set their alarm and remember what day to vote, and there's at least some risk there.
And the other point I want to make is just, we talk about floors and ceilings, right? I mean, we're such a calcified country that our presidential elections, at least for the foreseeable future, are going to be roughly 50-50. And it's the roughly that decides who's going to be in the Oval Office. But we now have enough data on Trump to know that he has got a ceiling. Generously, I think probably 48%, maybe 47 nationally, 48 in swing states, that no more than that will vote for him. That is just his ceiling. Harris's ceiling is higher than that. Now, it's hard work, right? What she's doing right now is she's trying to persuade people to vote who don't usually vote, who are not traditional Democrats, who don't have the muscle memory, maybe who don't know her that well. And that's hard. That's difficult. That's why it sucks that a minority party can win almost every time just because the way things are set up. But her ceiling is higher. And if you have to pick which of those camps you're on, are you going to pick the guy who has an absolute limit and just hope that the other side turnout is low enough that that's kind of enough for you to just squeak over the hump in these few states that get to pick the president? Or are you going to pick the side where we don't know how high her support could go and we don't know how high it's going to go, but there's a chance that it's going to go higher than the polls think it will right now? I mean, that's an easy choice, right? Even if it's still going to be close right up until the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we're saying overall is here, no guarantees. We're all going to be nervous on election night. But set aside this idea that the tide is going out rather than the tide is going in. She's in a good place. Maybe won't be enough, but I do think it is the rational thing to see the advantages that she has on her side, and everybody keep, to the extent that you were doing more than voting. You're canvassing, you're donating money, you're just kind of pumping up your friends, right, to keep them, to walk them back from the ledge and all that kind of stuff. Keep doing those things, and I think there's reason for very cautious optimism, and we'll see.
We'll see.
All right. I think that's all we have for this week. We will, of course, be back for, what is it? I guess, I don't know, maybe third to last or something to last. But anyway, that is all we have for this week. Anything else?
Nope. Keep calm. Carry on.
All right.
See you next week.
Yep. Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.